The story unfolding across the global South is one that challenges decades of assumptions about power, economics, and identity. At the center of this narrative stands a figure who has emerged as both a symbol of resistance and a catalyst for unity. Ibrahim Traoré, the young leader of Burkina Faso. His vision extends far beyond the borders of his nation. It reaches into the very heart of Africa's liberation struggle and connects to a wider alliance forming with African Americans in the United States and beyond. This convergence is sending ripples through international politics, and for many in Beijing, it represents an unanticipated challenge to carefully laid strategies of influence. The question is not just why this alliance matters, but why it terrifies a global superpower like China. To understand this dynamic, one must first appreciate the historical weight of both African and African American struggles. The African continent has endured centuries of colonization, resource exploitation, and externally imposed governance structures. Meanwhile, African Americans have carried the generational burden of slavery, systemic discrimination, and the long fight for civil rights within the United States. Despite the differences in geography and political context, the core of both struggles is rooted in a quest for dignity, sovereignty, and empowerment. When these two struggles intersect, they create a formidable cultural and political force with the potential to reshape the balance of global power. Ibrahim Traoré has tapped into this intersection with remarkable clarity. He recognizes that African liberation is not just about building new roads, schools, and institutions within Africa. It is about connecting Africa's cause to the diaspora that shares the same history of resistance. By reaching out to African American communities, thought leaders, and activists, Traoré is signaling a new phase of Pan-Africanism, one that transcends the continent itself. For China, which has invested billions of dollars into African infrastructure, mining, and trade, this development is unsettling. Why? Because Beijing's model of engagement has long been built on controlling the narrative, leveraging resources, and ensuring that Africa remains tied to China's economic orbit. An independent Africa, energized by diaspora connections, threatens to rewrite that script. China has worked carefully to present itself as a benevolent partner to Africa. The Belt and Road Initiative promised infrastructure and development while avoiding the overt political conditions of Western aid. Yet, beneath the glossy announcements lies a reality of debt dependence, strategic resource control, and the use of Africa as a testing ground for global influence. Beijing counted on the absence of a unified African voice to maintain its leverage. But what happens when that voice begins to find resonance not just in Africa, but among millions of African Americans in the United States? Suddenly, China finds itself facing a coalition that blends the financial and cultural influence of the diaspora with the raw material wealth and youthful energy of the African continent. The African American community in the United States wields significant cultural power, shaping global music, film, fashion, and discourse. When aligned with Africa's leaders and grassroots movements, this cultural influence becomes political capital. Ibrahim Traoré's speeches resonate far beyond Burkina Faso, spreading across social media platforms and reaching diaspora communities hungry for authentic African leadership. This transatlantic exchange of ideas is one that Beijing cannot easily co-opt. Unlike state-to-state diplomacy, it bypasses formal channels and lives in the hearts of people connected by identity, memory, and shared aspirations. China's fear stems from the unpredictability of such a movement. There is also a strategic dimension to this fear. China's rise as a global power has depended on securing access to resources in Africa: oil, cobalt, rare earth minerals, and agricultural land. The infrastructure projects, loans, and partnerships were all designed to cement long-term control over supply chains essential for China's manufacturing dominance. If African nations, inspired by leaders like Traoré and emboldened by diaspora support, begin to demand fairer terms, renegotiate contracts, or even expel exploitative foreign companies, Beijing's strategic calculations unravel. The combination of African sovereignty and diaspora activism could place immense pressure on U.S. lawmakers as well, forcing them to acknowledge African demands with greater seriousness. Suddenly, China is not negotiating with fragmented states, but with a globalized African identity backed by a network of influence that stretches from Ouagadougou to Washington. D.C., the symbolism of African Americans supporting African sovereignty, carries additional weight in the United States. For decades, U.S. policymakers often treated Africa as a secondary concern, focusing instead on Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. But as African Americans highlight their connection to Africa, the pressure grows on Washington to address African issues not simply as foreign policy challenges, but as matters of justice and heritage. This realignment could weaken China's ability to monopolize Africa's partnership, as the U.S. would find it politically costly to ignore African voices. From Beijing's perspective, this means losing the advantage of exploiting the vacuum left by Western neglect. Traoré's speeches often carry a moral undertone that resonates with audiences across both continents. He speaks not only of sovereignty, but of reclaiming dignity stolen through centuries of exploitation. This moral clarity has drawn the attention of African Americans who see in him echoes of their own leaders, figures like Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., and Angela Davis, who called for unity between Africa and its diaspora. In a world where authenticity is rare, Traoré's refusal to bow to Western or Chinese pressure makes him a beacon for those seeking leaders who act in the interest of their people rather than foreign powers. It is precisely this authenticity that makes him dangerous to Beijing's influence strategy, because it cannot be bought or silenced. China's fear is also grounded in timing. The world is currently in a period of flux, with old alliances breaking down and new ones being formed. The U.S.-China rivalry defines much of the 21st century geopolitical landscape, but Africa represents the swing region that could tilt the balance. With 1.4 billion people, vast resources, and rapidly growing economies, Africa is not merely a prize, it is a determinant of the future. If Africa aligns with China, Beijing strengthens its hand against the West. But if Africa asserts its independence with diaspora backing, the balance shifts again, creating a multipolar world in which China cannot dominate. One must also consider the psychological aspect of China's unease. For years, Beijing has projected an image of solidarity with Africa, invoking shared histories of colonial struggle. Yet the reality is that China is itself acting as a new form of external power, prioritizing its own interests over African welfare. The growing consciousness among Africans and African Americans exposes this contradiction. It strips away the narrative veneer and reveals the transactional nature of China's engagement. Beijing fears the day when young Africans begin to see Chinese involvement, not as partnership, but as neo-colonialism wrapped in different packaging. Traoré and the diaspora's dialogue accelerates that awakening. It is not only about economics or culture, it is also about security. China has expanded its military presence in Africa with bases, training programs, and arms sales. This quiet militarization ensures that its investments are protected. However, a unified African and African American movement could frame this presence as an occupation rather than assistance. This reframing has the potential to destabilize China's security strategy and force costly adjustments. Moreover, as social movements in the U.S. echo calls for African sovereignty, the reputational cost to China grows. Beijing's carefully curated image as the champion of the global South begins to collapse under scrutiny. The fear is amplified by the unpredictability of grassroots power. Governments can be negotiated with, pressured, or incentivized. But movements powered by identity and cultural solidarity are less predictable, less controllable, and more enduring. China's experience has been in dealing with elites, leaders who could be convinced or pressured into agreements. But the alliance of Africans and African Americans is not confined to political leadership. It is a people-driven movement. Traoré may be its most visible face, but the power comes from millions of individuals connected by shared heritage. For Beijing, This represents an opponent unlike any it has faced before, one that cannot be easily contained through contracts, aid packages, or diplomatic outreach. The implications extend beyond China. The entire global system, built on hierarchies of economic power, faces a test when marginalized voices find unity. An African-American-African alliance signals that the days of external powers dictating terms are numbered. The fear in Beijing is not simply about losing resources, it is about losing control over a narrative it has invested in for decades. Control over narratives shapes legitimacy, and legitimacy is the currency of global influence. Once that control slips, no amount of infrastructure loans or trade deals can fully restore it. Ibrahim Traoré's rise illustrates how one leader, by tapping into deeper historical currents, can alter global dynamics. His outreach to the diaspora is not a gesture of symbolism. It is a deliberate strategy to create a power base that transcends borders. The African-American community, with its economic influence and cultural dominance, provides the visibility that Africa's struggles have often lacked. This visibility disrupts China's strategy of operating in shadows, away from global scrutiny. Suddenly, deals signed in silence are illuminated by the spotlight of diaspora activism and media attention. For Beijing, the most terrifying prospect is that this alliance could inspire similar movements elsewhere. If Africa can unite with its diaspora, what stops Latin America from doing the same? What prevents South Asia from reconnecting with its diasporas across Europe and North America? The precedent of transnational identity-driven alliances could unravel the dominance of state-to-state diplomacy, shifting power toward communities and movements. In such a world, China's playbook of centralized negotiation loses much of its effectiveness. This is why China watches Traoré so closely. His speeches are not just rhetoric. They are seeds planted in the fertile ground of collective memory. They awaken a sense of possibility among Africans and African Americans alike, that perhaps the future does not belong to Beijing or Washington, but to the people who have long been excluded from decision-making. For China, this awakening is a nightmare scenario. For Africa and its diaspora, it is a dream long deferred, now stirring to life. The story of why China fears this alliance is, in essence, the story of a new chapter in global history. It is about the reclaiming of agency by those who were once silenced. It is about a unity that cuts across oceans and centuries, uniting two halves of the same heritage. Ibrahim Traoré has given voice to this unity, and in doing so, he has shaken the certainties of great powers. Whether this alliance fulfills its promise remains to be seen, but its very existence has already changed the conversation. The world is no longer a chessboard of empires. It is becoming a stage where those once confined to the margins are now stepping into the light. And for Beijing, that is the most terrifying development of all.